My name is Henry Sales. The title of my project is a little long. It's called A Cautionary Tale, Intersections of Class and Politics in Britain's Past and Present. So just before we really dive into it, a few of the key things that we'll be focusing on in this project are the national politics of the United Kingdom, political ideology and identification, the dynamics of social class in the United Kingdom. So a lot of Americans, when they identify people and their political beliefs, their ideologies, they may not associate social class as such a predictive determinant of how people think, how they live, what they eat, where they go to school. But I find that in both present contemporary British society and also examination of history, social class has a very deep and profound effect in all of those different areas for people across society. And then finally, we're going to connect it with what we see as the most recent trend, the rise of far-right populism. So I have a few central questions here that we're going to keep going back to throughout the presentation. So number one, to what significance does social class predict an individual's political identification, vote choice, and ideology? Furthermore, to get deeper into that, does identification as working class correlate with right-wing populist views and parties, your vote choice and your identification and your ideology? And finally, in a broader sense, how have the political developments of the second half of the 20th century caused this suspected working class alienation and marginalization? So to sort of start with a central overview of what we're going to go through my research, it was my estimation that a lot of the political and also economic developments of the past 50 years have contributed to this alienation, marginalization of the working class in the British political sphere. And through my data that I collected that I'm going to show later, we show that working class identification does have a strong effect, like I've said previously. And then these trends through the ideological indicators and vote choice have manifested themselves in part in recent political history, most strongly the far-right populist rise. So just to get a sense of how the British government defines class typically, and this is still used in the modern sense, it's split into sort of a binary category with subcategories within it, ABC1 and C2DE. So the top category is often, the professional class, those with university degrees, those who live in mostly university-educated areas, and they perform jobs as such. And the bottom category is people that are doing manual or semi-skilled labor, or that are unemployed or on benefits. For the purpose of these keystone, my focus wasn't so much on technical or financial definitions of class. It was more about self-identification of class because I felt that was more important. A lot of people, wrongly misidentify their own social class, but I actually felt that was stronger to use in my project because it's about the sort of self-stereotypes and your own conceptions of where you fit in society, where you fit with other people in society, where you live, where you go to school, and where you work. So I thought that it was much more relevant to focus on a more tripartite model between upper, middle, and working class, where the middle is the sort of baseline university-educated professional class, and the working is both skilled and semi-skilled and unskilled labor. Particularly, we're going to focus on the dynamic between middle and working. So to sort of start a historical overview of what we're talking about here, we can go back roughly 60 years or so to the fallout of the Second World War. Churchill's government had been defeated in the general election in 1945, and largely because there were a lot of large, sort of forward-thinking societal needs that needed problem solving. Those included access to public health. Those included access to quality education for vast swaths of the population. Those included protections for workers' rights, the need for housing for returning soldiers and their families. So a lot of these needs that previously were just not met by both liberal and conservative British governments, they came to the fore after the war. And the Labour government of Clement Attlee, I think, really tried to capitalize on these needs by instituting a wide range of programs like the National Health Service, the starting of things like council estates, more nationalized industries, more government involvement, and fundamentally changing the way that society interacts with its people. Now, for better or for worse, this did produce, and you can, whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, you can have a different take on this. But throughout the 60s and 70s, there was a rise of inflation in the UK. Nationalized industries were losing money. They were falling prey to really bad mismanagement. There was also, at the same time as the British working class was losing its political and economic capital, there was an acceleration of mass immigration from former colonies of the British Empire. So we think of Afro-Caribbean peoples, people from North Africa, people from the Middle East, people from the Indian subcontinent. So they were moving into British population centers en masse when the native working class was facing economic stagnation and indeed decline. This most poignantly resulted in what's known as the Winter of Discontent in 78 and 79. After a series of strikes, lots of nationalized industries like sanitation, coal, things like that, were brought to a grinding halt. Public services were brought to a halt. And this really sort of woke society up, and it created an environment for, I wouldn't say opportunists, but people who would come to the fore with radically new difference of what the British government should do and what society should look like. And then that leads us to Thatcher's Britain. So think of, I guess the most American way I can put this is to frame it in sort of a similar way to the Reagan administration. So prioritizing things like private growth, financial deregulation, sort of hands-off approach to the economy, denationalization of industry because, it is thought that industry could run better in the hands of private bosses and not the over-regulated controls of government. And the central enemy, sort of the villain that the Thatcher government cast, were trade unions. They thought they were out of control, they thought they manipulated their workers, and they thought that they brought societal industries to a halt. And so that caused a lot of unrest both on class and race-based lines. Then finally, that had a pretty sizable effect in shifting the political spectrum, if not to the right, to the center, where both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party were fighting for this middle ground. This middle ground, this aspirational middle class that didn't want to be identified with the old chaos of the working class, saw themselves as unique and deserving of new opportunities. And that's sort of when Tony Blair's New Labour came to the fore. We talk about that big tent approach to politics, changing the labor constitution itself to accommodate private industry and private enterprise over the sort of default labor stance of nationalization. And finally, we go to the most recent political developments. After the credit crisis, the Cameron government did little to stymie economic decline. Their austerity measures didn't really work. The marginalization of the working classes, both economically and politically, continued. You can see that reflected in a lot of modern data trends. And sort of the way that came to the fore was in the European referendum in 2016, in which the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. And there's lots of different data indicators within the vote, which makes it pretty clear that you see that a lot of areas that were reliant on steady working class labor, protected by working class labor, were now adrift. Some continued to vote with a more liberal approach, and some went to what we see today as a far-right populism under a party like UKIP. And so, just to go through these conclusions quickly, we see regional shifts in prosperity, we see mass immigration coinciding with the decline of the British working class, and then also polarization in politics as political parties have sought to reclaim the middle ground, and the unskilled or semi-skilled working class has largely been left to fend for themselves because a lot of them feel that their interests aren't represented, rightly or wrongly. That's what the literature of the time is saying. And the sort of culmination of my project was a YouGov survey that was released to around 1,600 adult recipients in the UK. And it was designed to play out different elements of social class identification, vote choice, ideology, and views on things, say like how you voted in the European referendum, your views on immigration, that I associated most closely with the rise of the far-right populist movement. So I'll go through this pretty quickly, but here's one of the central graphs I thought was very important here. We see that on a breakdown in terms of the vote in the 2015 general election, the party structure holds apart from the far-right UKIP, which you see much over 60% of working class respondents in my survey said they voted for UKIP, or just over 20 middle class respondents did. So that shows a clear breakdown in terms of who's thinking what and who's voting for what candidates. And then here, we see the same breakdown reflected in a more acute way. So of the Remain, those who have benefited from a service-based economy, university educations, they largely voted to remain in the United Kingdom, to remain in the European Union, while the working class, the opposite is flipped in even a more profound way. And finally, I wanted to test with something which was slightly auxiliary to my project, but I think it bears some mentioning. So I set up a list experiments designed to test social desirability bias in terms of displaying your concern for immigration. So people were given different lists of things that usually concern people, and immigration would be added to the second list, and you would compare two random samples. The difference is that while people are asked directly, they often, just over half of them say they're concerned by immigration to the United Kingdom, while if they're asked indirectly, that number is up to 82%, which means there's an almost 30% difference just because of social desirability bias, people not wanting to admit their actual concerns, and in this case, it's concerns about mass immigration. And of course, this came with a strong working class or middle class dimension, as we see that those different class identifications are funneled into some pretty typical results, as we see in this list experiment. So some of the central conclusions that I'll go through that I've found: class does have a strong predictive effect in determining party ID, political ideology, and vote choice. The political developments of the past 50 years have, for better or for worse, contributed to this reorganization of society and class politics in the UK, and also the messaging of different parties to capture certain segments of voters. And this itself has manifested in part with the rise of right-wing populism, and that is reflected both in my survey, but also contemporary data and recent literature on things like the rise of UKIP and the rise of the far right. And so obviously this is just the tip of the iceberg. Further study could be warranted on things like certain regions losing industry, political consequences of losing labor protection, and more broadly, this is the big ticket question, the economic future of the Western working class in an increasingly changed and changing economy. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to everyone. And my advisor, Doug Kreiner, for whom I couldn't have completed this project, and also KHC students and faculty. So, yes, question.
So I think that what you did is very good and very thorough. A couple of other things you have to integrate in. Historically, a portion of the British working class has voted conservative. Yes. Since the original bills of 1867 and 1884, there was a whole politics of deference. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the reasons that's important is that while class is certainly a significant factor in British history, it is, as you say, a very complicated one. And one thing you mentioned that I think needs to loom larger in the story is the very different fates of different regions of the country, urban metropolitan England, yes, versus the shires. If you look closely, as you know, at the Brexit vote, I think that proves the point. The other thing is that there's a political story here about Britain's search for a role after the Second World War, the loss of the empire, the so-called special relationship with the United States, and a lot of ambivalence towards Europe in a section of the Conservative Party, almost from the inception of, or the beginning of Britain's role in the common market. And that gets really out of hand. And that, I think, is not about class. That's about something else. So I think just complicating factors in an interesting story.
No, I definitely agree with that. And I included some of that in my actual writing. I didn't quite get to it here, but when you talk about the fates of certain regions, that's definitely something that I looked at in terms of old industrial areas, especially in the Midlands and the Northwest and the Northeast, facing both political and economic decline, social unrest. and largely to this day have not found an economic sector and a service-based economy to support a wide spectrum of working class jobs in those regions. And conversely, we see regions like London and the Southeast who have benefited greatly from a more globalized world, new economic sectors growing up. And like you said, this has contributed to an ambivalence towards Europe in certain segments of the population that have not felt the benefits of a new economy and the shifting political ground.
Except that the initial Tory opposition on top were from people who tended to be well off, public school, if not Oxbridge educated.
No, that's
so,
very true.
Yeah,
that's very true.
That's another part of the whole picture. It's a complicated picture.
Yeah, it is.
You do a very good job.
It is. So for this project, I focused more on like the working class itself, but that was always something in the background. You know, the actual political decision makers and policy makers that were shaping this narrative. So that's very true. Yes.
Were you able to do any, in your other research, able to do any comparison of data between voter identification and class identification, say the 1950s and 2015-16?
Yes. So that's another point. You know, largely I'm not sure in terms of voter identification, but in terms of just class identification, over the past 50 years, we have seen a steady decline, at least in the polls that I was looking at, so the British election study polls, of people who self-identify as working class, and a subtle rise of people who self-identify as middle class. And so I think that's contributed to a lot of how political parties talk to certain voter bases, the people they select to campaign towards, and then the actual governments that get into power to affect policy. So, anything else?